Hello and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out in the direction here to the southeast of Mariupol. First we saw some fighting in the Dacha area here to the north of Mariupol last month, and now we're seeing some fighting here east of Chervone. The main fighting here is just a few probing attacks between the Russians and the Ukrainian positions, where they're checking whether or not the Ukrainian positions here are strong, how well fortified are they, etc. And this is what you actually call probing attacks, a few attacks with weeks or months in between, checking the readiness of the opponent's forces, not something like the Ukrainians did in their summer offensive, where the entire offensive was just probing attacks for many months on a daily basis. The specific date for the fighting in the Dacha area is the 27th of February, so approximately 2 weeks ago. But with this, we see that the Russians are continuing such probing attacks here in the direction of Mariupol. After fighting in Robotyne didn't really lead anywhere, we see with the latest reports that the Ukrainians have withdrawn from most of the trenches to the south. But if we take a look at the full fortifications map, we can see that they still have some here to the southeast of Robotyne and generally in the eastern and northern parts. While in the west, the Russians have control over the fortifications, and in the south, it is now in the gray zone. We see that there's continuous fighting, and the Russians have been fighting both in the east of Robotyne and towards the village itself. But in the village itself, they have not succeeded in getting a proper foothold or control over the village. According to the Russian sources, this is happening due to the Ukrainian command or Syrsky sending additional reinforcements to the front line, to a point at which they claim that the vast majority of the Ukrainian reserves are now committed to the front line. With that, we see that the Ukrainians have sent all of their most important brigades to the front line, and they're trying to hold back Russian advances or a breakthrough. This is to stall the fighting, to prevent the Russians from making any sort of breakthrough throughout the front, to give this idea that they're still holding on, that they can still fight until the United States again decides to give them aid, if they are going to. The Ukrainians are holding on for as long as possible to try and speed up the US decision. And if a Russian breakthrough happens somewhere in the front, they fear that the US will never send them any additional aid, for fear that Ukraine will just lose before they actually receive it or before they make use of it. The message being sent that the Ukrainians can hold on without US aid, but they cannot win without US aid. However, what we're seeing is that they are trading men for time, and that is a very bad strategy in a battle of attrition, especially when the time is in hope that the US possibly sends aid when there's a strong resistance in the US for aid. And even if aid were to arrive at that point, it would need to be significantly larger than what they have received so far to be able to make up for all the men that they have lost and all the fortifications that they have lost holding onto these positions during that time. So the Russians are grinding down the Ukrainians as the Ukrainians are trying to buy time. We see here to the southwest of Volodar yet again an area where they have launched prior probing attacks, and now they're launching it again, and it was even confirmed with this geolocated footage showing their presence here in the forest lines. The prior Russian advance here or probing attack here was on the 20th of February, or approximately 3 weeks ago. It is reported by Russian sources that these probing attacks are taking place following a Russian rotation and sending additional forces to the front line to new places where they now will continue to pressure the Ukrainians across the whole front line. The plan of the Russians is to put pressure everywhere on the front, from Robotyne to Mariupol, down south by the Remetsky Ledge and south of Volodar, in the Novomikhailivka direction, in the whole Avdiivka Donetsk front, as well as in the direction of Bakhmut, by the Serbianki Forest area in Kreminna, and north by Kupiansk. All of this to spread the Ukrainian forces thinly and force them to commit even more of their reserves to the point that they don't have anyone left, and also to continue pressuring and grinding down the Ukrainian army. Their hope is that it would lead to a position where the Ukrainians have their whole army committed to the front, and would be vulnerable in other areas that are not currently parts of the front line, so that they can possibly open a new front that could break through the Ukrainian defenses or even collapse the Ukrainian army by simply putting so much pressure on the front line, especially with the loss of anti-air defenses and the heavy increase of Russian Air Force using or bombarding the whole front line with the FAB 500s and now also FAB 1500s throughout the front line. All of this adds up to this example here, which is a new Ukrainian raid into Belgorod. We have this video footage here. A Russian drone detected some Ukrainian vehicles, including the Caesar cannons, which were sent from Denmark. It was actually pretty disturbing that Danish artillery cannons are being used inside of Russia, despite the Ukrainians being asked not to. But we see that Western weapons being sent to Ukraine are being used here by the border area to shell into Belgorod. The Russian drone found this and detected these artillery pieces, after which both airstrikes, artillery strikes, and general heavy bombardment took place on these Ukrainian positions. As we can see with the footage here, massive explosions coming from the artillery strikes and airstrikes on these Ukrainian vehicles that are being used by the border area to conduct a raid into Belgorod and to cover for this raid with artillery. While at the same time moving back to the front line, we see first off in the direction of Pobeda, it is reported that the Russians, as is shown in this picture here, has reached some of these leopards that were disabled close to Pobeda in this section of the front line. And it is reported that this one in the picture here is being sent to Russia. That would be the first captured Leopard tank that is actually being sent back to Russia by the Russian soldiers. So far, there has been some that were disabled and abandoned, but the Russians haven't had the ability to get their hands on them, specifically here in the southern front by Robotyne, because the Russians have not really recaptured the areas where the Leopards would say were destroyed or disabled. And at the same time, also here in the Luhansk front, where the Russians yet again have disabled some were retrieved by the Ukrainians, and some are simply too far back for the Russians to get their hands on them. But for the first time here in the direction of Pobeda, the Russians have gotten their hands on one of these Leopard tanks. Moving on to the next section, we see here in the direction of Berdycheiv that the Ukrainians continue their counterattacks in an attempt to recapture Berdycheiv and push the Russians out. However, as we see in this picture here, this is the fourth destroyed Abrams tank. They are launching these small assaults with a couple of Abrams together with Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, allowing them to reach the eastern parts of Berdycheiv, but they end up getting destroyed, and the Russian soldiers reached back to the front. They have taken a selfie with the first Abrams tank that was destroyed here in the central parts of Berdycheiv, showing that they have still locations here within the village. And the Ukrainians, with their counterattacks, sometimes they successfully ambush Russian soldiers. Other times the result is just a few destroyed Abrams. At this rate, there is 4 destroyed Abrams and 2 M1150, which is just a small part of what the Ukrainians have, but it is adding up slowly. And over the Battle of Berdycheiv, so far 4 Abrams being destroyed and somewhere around 5 to 6 Bradleys being destroyed over this village. It is something that shows that the Ukrainians are definitely committing a significant portion of their units. The 47th Mechanized Brigade, which has all of the Abrams tanks, is the one fighting here in the Berdycheiv direction. And now for the 3rd time in the last 6 months, the brigade has a new commander. The one who was commanding the brigade has been fired. The first one was following the Ukrainian failures in the summer offensive. The second one was once Syrsky got command. And the third one is now again just a week or 2 weeks after the second one. We are now seeing that they have fired the commander again. This will create issues with the faith in the brigade. As militaryland.net writes, the brigade in which many put a lot of faith struggles. Moving on to the Bakhmut front, we see here in that section that fighting takes and continues here as well, with this picture here by Ryber, including a lot of geolocated footage. We see that the Ukrainians are struggling to deal with the heavy bombardments and heavy assaults taking place here to the west of Bakhmut. Within the village of Ivanivske, there are constant assaults across the whole village, and north of it towards the Ukrainian fortifications, there are constant bombardments. We see in the geolocated footage there's both cluster munitions being shot at Ukrainian trenches, artillery strikes, and FAB strikes on the Ukrainian positions. This is happening all throughout the front here from Berdycheiv and down to Ivanivske and towards Chasiv Yar. This triangle is day in and day out over the past few weeks, constantly under bombardments, and this is very taxing for the Ukrainians fighting in this section of the front line. And if this continues and the Ukrainians just keep sending reinforcements into such a triangle, they'll just increase the rate at which they are losing their troops. And with that, I'm going to end off this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.